welcome to another wonderful episode of Paranormal Minds. I'm your host, Shannon Ray, and I hope all of you have had a wonderful, fun-filled week since I saw you here last week. Tonight we have a very special guest, Kevin Randle, and before I bring Mr. Randle in, I'd like to tell you a few things about him. Kevin Randle has been a professional writer for nearly 30 years with published works that include science fiction, action-adventure, techno-thrillers, and over 20 books of nonfiction. Randle has varied military background and was decorated in 2 wars. Given his military background of over 27 years of service, he is considered an expert on military matters and has been called upon by various media agencies for his expertise, I should say. My bad. He has worked in a private industry as a presentation writer for Rockwell International, and he has hosted a radio program on El Paso's KTSM, which explored the paranormal. He has studied anthropology at the University of Iowa, psychology at the California Coast University, and history with an emphasis on intelligence at the American Military University. He holds 4 degrees, including a Ph.D. In psychology and a Master of the Arts in Military Studies. And without further ado, and to talk about his various works this evening, I would like to bring in Mr. Kevin Randle. How are you doing, Mr. Randle?
I'm doing fine, and you?
I'm hanging in there. Definitely, it's been a rather hot week. I'm here in Georgia, and so it's been a little bit hotter than what it's normally been. So I'm trying to get used to this heat, so to speak, for the summer.
That's why we invented air conditioning.
Yeah, that's true. But then you gotta go outside at some point. You can't just live inside.
You go out when it's cooler.
I wish it was that way. It doesn't work that way. The only time it's cooler is like at 10 o'clock at night and all the stores are closed and I don't know. We get used to it here in Georgia. It's just a transitional period, so to speak. So I did want to start by talking with you first about kind of what led up to your interest within the paranormal field. I know that you've written tons of books, but what contributed to your interest in the paranormal field and kind of got that started?
Well, I always blame my mother for this, and she had an interest in science fiction, and that deals with space travel and alien civilizations and that sort of thing. And of course, UFOs, which is part of the paranormal, deals with space travel and alien civilization. So it wasn't a large step from the world of science fiction into looking at UFOs and trying to learn as much as I could about them. It's always been kind of a fascinating subject as well. So that's kind of how we got started, or I got started.
So would you say your mother was just very into it and interested and kind of just reflected that interest upon you? Was that interest in, spirits, or was it specifically UFOs, or how did that go?
Well, her interest was mainly in science fiction. And if you look at what science fiction does and where science fiction is, that was kind of where she was. And it's science fiction as opposed to fantasy and some of those things. And of course, that kind of nurtured the interest in science fiction in me, but also when I learned about UFOs or flying saucers, that kind of sprung from there. And I remember she took me, when I was a little kid, took me into a movie called Earth versus the Flying Saucers. And that of course, sparked a real interest in flying saucers and UFOs.
So, did your work within the military ever lead you to any unsolved questions which might have fueled your paranormal quest, so to speak?
No, when I was in various aspects of the military, I would periodically run across some things. And when I say some things, basically UFO reports, but it was never part of my job or never part of what I was doing at that time. So the interest in the paranormal, the interest in UFOs really didn't spring from the military, and there really was no reinforcement in the military. It was just simply something that I was interested in, and I would periodically look for things that dealt with that. So, that was kind of how it is. The military career was kind of a military career, and even though I had this interest, and I had written quite a bit about flying saucers or UFOs, especially when I was in the Air Force, it never really inhibited my career. It never caused me any real trouble.
Okay. So I want to take a moment just to talk about UFOs in general, because I have a lot of guys on here that, are UFOologists and they, have different books. So I kind of like to get each guest's standpoint, so to speak. So what, are your personal beliefs or hypothesis of the origins of UFOs?
Given the information I have, given the studies I've done and the investigations I've conducted and the people I've talked to, it's my opinion that the UFOs represent an alien visitation, and by alien I mean extraterrestrial. It'd be like we of Earth going to another planet. But we don't have what I think of as the proof positive, meaning yes, it's extraterrestrial and we can exclude everything else. There's a smaller possibility we're dealing with some kind of interdimensional thing that we don't understand. There's a possibility we're dealing with time travelers from the future. There's other aspects of it like that, but I think based on what I've seen and what I've heard, that the most likely explanation for what's going on is extraterrestrial alien visitation.
So, do you believe that the government is working on hiding the UFO phenomenon, so to speak?
I think there's no question about that. When I was working on the book on the UFO government files, what was interesting was I came across a name in the Foo Fighter investigation, and the Foo Fighters were these things seen during the Second World War, and they didn't know what to call them, they didn't know how to deal with them. They named them Foo Fighters. And there was a guy who was involved in the investigation of them named Colonel Howard McCoy. After the war ended and nobody cared about Foo Fighters anymore because they obviously weren't a secret weapon by the Nazis or a secret weapon by the Japanese, it was something that no longer concerned them. The investigations kind of fizzled out, but then the ghost rockets appeared over Sweden in 1946, and there was one guy involved in some of that investigation. That was Howard McCoy. We moved to December of 1946, and this is before we get a lot of UFO sightings or flying disc sightings in the United States. In December of 1946, McCoy and a couple of other people are charged with creating an unofficial investigation of these sorts of things. And so they're working out of a single office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And then after Kenneth Arnold had his sighting in June of 1947 of the objects near Mount Rainier, the unofficial investigation became an official investigation, and Howard McCoy is involved with that. There was a request from an Army Brigadier General about UFOs, and he sent a letter to the Air Materiel Command about it, and he listed some 14, 18 cases, and he wanted an analysis of these things. And the guy who actually conducted the analysis was Howard McCoy. So we've got this one officer moving from, the thread that ties it all together is Howard McCoy. So we end up with Project Sign, which is the Air Force investigation of UFOs, and it's Howard McCoy that's involved in all of this stuff, and that's how we launch it. But a lot of the material that McCoy gathered in those early years, when we get to Project Blue Book and we're looking at the files, it no longer exists. It's gone. It's lost. There's no record of it being destroyed. It's just disappeared. But we can find in some of the reports issued by the official UFO investigations, we can find references back to that stuff. So clearly, stuff has been removed. Stuff is being hidden. They're attempting to direct public opinion into certain ways, which leads away from an interest in UFOs and a belief that these things are of extraterrestrial origin.
So, I know that a lot of these general questions are going to touch on a lot of your books, but you have a lot of books, in all fairness. So, if one applies to it, you can just kind of plug that book, because I know I have a question about Area 51, and I know you have a book just for that. So, forgive me. I promise I'm not attempting to bounce around. It's just you have a lot of books.
That's fine.
So, which is a good thing. It's a great thing because you're so well knowledged in this subject matter. But I promise I'm not trying to be disrespectful in doing so. Why, as an ex-military gentleman, what's the deal with Area 51? I mean, I know you wrote a book about it, but I mean, what's your personal beliefs on that one?
Area 51, I think, was the base designed to test the next generation of military aircraft. That was where the SR-71 was developed, for example, in the 1950s. And here's an aircraft with 1950s technology that can outrun missiles that are fired at it. It's so fast. It flies so high that the Soviets really couldn't do anything to counter our flying over their their airspace in an SR-71. And I think that the base at Area 51, the Groom Lake installation, S4, all of that was designed specifically to create, to generate, to test the next generation of military aircraft under secrecy so that the secrets developed there wouldn't leak to our competitors in the world. So I think Area 51 really has little relevance to the world of UFOs, but it has a great deal to do with the creation of military aircraft and the technologies that go into those aircraft.
So even if Area 51 isn't, the government working to, conspire against hiding this UFO phenomenon, how do you believe that they're trying to hide the conclusive proof? Do they have some kind of internal, department, or how does that work where you're trying to hide this from, a national population?
What we look at is, take the Roswell UFO crash, for example. We know that where the thing fell, we know what happened to the debris, we know what happened to the alien creatures recovered there. We know all of this material went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field at the time. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is a big research and development facility. We know that one of the bodies was taken to Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado, for example, because the Army, and in 1947, this was the Army Air Forces, so the Army had a big mortuary facility there, and they were attempting to learn what they could about preserving those bodies without them deteriorating, because you've got a sample of an alien body. It's not like you're going to get many more. You have to be very careful with what you have.
Yeah.
And so we can look at all of that sort of thing, but once we get to Wright-Patterson, the trail goes cold. There are hints of things that went other places for research and development, but we don't have a lot of good, solid information about that. And so I think, you look at that, and once you've got something like that, I think it only makes logical sense that they would create some sort of a organization, albeit a small organization, because you need it to be small to keep the secret, to sort of exploit the finds that we have. And there's a much larger organization, which I think some people join just because they don't want you to believe in alien creatures for some reason. That they use to debunk these things. And all through the history of the UFO field, we can see these debunking attempts. In 1969, the Air Force, actually in 1967, I think it was, the Air Force gave $550,000 to the University of Colorado to investigate UFOs. And you think, well, here's a scientific investigation. But when you get into the history of this thing and you look at the documentation, you realize the Air Force sent a letter to the university and said, here's what we want you to find. And the university wrote back and said, yeah, we got that. And when the investigation concluded, they found exactly what the Air Force wanted them to find. And so we can see through that sort of thing, and the documentation exists. We have copies of the letter. It was written by a lieutenant colonel named Robert Hippler, as a matter of fact. So we have copies of the letter. We know exactly what it said. And it said, find this stuff and say good things about what the Air Force has done, and we'll go from there. It allows us to close the program. Well, we know they didn't close the program. They merely closed the public name of it, and they continued investigating UFOs under other code names. So we can look at all of this stuff, and we know that this conspiracy has gone on since, most in the UFO field would say 1947. I say now, based on what I've learned in the last couple of years, starting in the early 1940s, 1940, 1941, and has continued on until today.
Now, I know this might sound like, a minute question, but the general public, their ideology of what a alien looks like is very glamorized by what Hollywood cast in their certain movies. What is your perception on your research and things of that nature of what a type of extraterrestrial would look like?
You think about this periodically, and I would think that if you've got an alien creature evolving on another planet, it really wouldn't look like us at all. We don't know what sort of environmental pressures would be on a being, an intelligent being, as it evolved on another planet. But then again, I've heard others say, and some of them much more learned than I, that the human form is sort of the best environmental. You get the most environmental advantages from the human type form. When we look at the descriptions of the creatures recovered at Roswell, for example, they are humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a single head, 2 eyes, that sort of thing. They're humanoid as opposed to human, but they're much smaller. They're not nearly as robust. A couple of people described them as looking like children of 9 or 10 years old. So they're very skinny. They're not real robust type things. They have the 2 eyes. They have the 2 ears. That sort of thing, but the heads are larger than human heads. So if you look at it from one point of view, you can say, well, that doesn't make sense that you'd have a humanoid type creature evolving independently in another world, and yet you can say, well, there are things that you would expect evolution would do to create an intelligent creature. One of that being that you develop an opposable thumb so you can manipulate tools. You have the eyes in the front of the head, and that allows you to judge distances for depth perception, and that creates pressures on the development of the brain. So there's all kinds of things you can look at there. When we look at a history of what creatures have looked like people have reported, we get a lot of humanoids. We get some human-type creatures, but we get some things that are out of science fiction. In one case, they described the creatures as attacking these guys in South America as hairy jelly beans or hairy beanbags, something like that. So you've got a wide range of stuff like that, and that would suggest maybe we've got more than one alien species observing us, or maybe they can manipulate perception so that they look more human than they really are. There's all kinds of things when you get to a technology that is far enough advanced, as Arthur C. Clarke said, it begins to look like magic. And if you take a look at what we can do today compared to what people could do 100 years ago, 150 years ago, our technology would certainly look like magic to people from that era.
Yeah, absolutely. So I gotta ask, just out of, curiosity, because a lot of people that I discuss things with, such as this, that are skeptics, I hear quite frequently, well, why would some alien or, extraterrestrial travel X amount of distance to just come and watch, or to just, to not interact, or to not let it know that it was here? What's your standpoint on that when you hear skeptics say stuff of that nature?
I say anthropology. Observe but don't interact.
Yeah.
The prime directive from Star Trek, for example. There may be all sorts of reasons why an alien society wouldn't want to interact with our society. And to presume that we can figure out what they want to do, it's kind of the height of our stupidity in one respect. We don't know what motivates an alien species. We don't know what their motivations are. We can't perceive to do it because we have nothing in common with them other than intelligence. And that may not be enough. So they may just be that way. They prefer to observe as opposed to interact. They might be studying us to see how civilizations evolve, or what would we have done if we could go back and watch the Romans, for example, or the Egyptians? Would we interact with them and teach them how to build stuff, or we just sit around and kind of see how their society evolved and how they lived on a day-to-day basis? So we really don't know what their motivation may be, why they would stay separate from us, other than the fact that I don't know how many times I've read in various accounts, somebody saw a UFO and they thought that the first thing they should do is shoot at it. So maybe our hostility is keeping them at arm's length.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're really kind of looking at what we had going on to begin with, I don't know if I'd be jumping for joy to interact to begin with, just from, national politics and worldly issues, let's put it that way.
You can look at that too. I mean, how dangerous are we?
Yeah.
And if I'm an alien species and I discover that this civilization on another planet is taking the first steps into space and is developing the atomic weapons that they could use to destroy themselves, or or really mess up our life if they could get to us. I might be interested in observing how quickly they're making their strides into space in case they suddenly threaten us in some fashion. But you look at the distances and the travel times, I don't think we're going to pose a threat to them anytime in the very near future, but there's always a possibility that we make some kind of breakthrough and suddenly we can travel interstellar distances a lot quicker than we thought possible.
Mm-hmm. So with all this observation and stuff of that nature and just UFO sightings in general, how do abductions play into, these thought processes? And I mean, are we even, so much as saying that abductions are relevant and, true? Are people truly being taken?
I have a problem with the way the abduction field is looked at today, with multiple abductions of the same individuals over and over and the vast numbers. It just doesn't seem likely that many abductions could be taking place without us getting a better handle on it. And I've talked to Travis Walton about this. I've talked to Betty Hill's niece, Catherine Martin, about this. That those sorts of abductions, a single-time target of opportunity thing, makes more sense to me than the multi-generational things that people talk about today. But they talk about the creatures coming into the house. I think that I reported that the first time that it ever happened. I mean, people today say, well, it's been happening to you for generations. But in 1976, I interviewed a woman living in Utah, who told me that the aliens had come into the house and taken them out for examination on the ship. And I think that's the first time that was ever reported anywhere, that sort of thing had happened. Prior to that, the abductions has always been sort of the target of opportunity. If you go back to Villas Boas in Brazil, he was out plowing the field at night because it was cooler that way. Mm-hmm. I just throw that in so that you would know that I was paying attention earlier. But he was a target of opportunity. The hills seemed to be a target of opportunity. Travis Walton was a target of opportunity. They were out there where they could be abducted without causing a lot of ancillary observation. Barker and Hickson in Pascagoula, a target of opportunity. So for me, the abduction phenomena makes more sense in that realm, but I also know there's explanations for some of that, and I think an awful lot of the abduction phenomena is explainable in terrestrial terms, meaning simply that, and I always hesitate to mention this because people take it the wrong way, but sleep paralysis does play into this. And people say, well, I was wide awake when it happened. Well, that may be you, but you look at what David Jacobs described as a typical abduction, and what he's described as sleep paralysis. And so that plays into that. So we have to be careful to separate those things. And Catherine Martin and I have actually talked about this, of developing a protocol that would be able to separate an episode of sleep paralysis from an episode of alien abduction. Mm-hmm. And there are little things that she looks for in her research that may suggest sleep paralysis or may suggest an abduction. So, but sleep paralysis would be a terrestrial explanation, and there are other terrestrial explanations that play into it as well. So we're kind of in the same point we would be with all UFO sightings. In the UFO sightings, they say 95%, 96% of them are explainable as natural phenomenon or misinterpretations or blatant hoaxes. And I think we may be at a point with the abduction phenomenon where we can say, well, there are terrestrial explanations that play into this, and maybe a very, very small number of them involve some kind of an alien interaction.
So, are you scared or intrigued by UFOs, and what should the general public be?
Well, if I was going to have some fun, I'd say I'm just frightened to death, and I've built this bunker around my house, and I'm heavily armed. But the other side of the coin is even if you mark the beginning of the modern era from Kenneth Arnold sighting in June of 1947, as I say, I go back to the 1940s, and I think the case is made in the book about that. But they've been around since then, sort of in our public consciousness since then, and there doesn't seem to be any really overt hostility on their parts. They haven't really done anything. They haven't shown up with their invasion fleets. So I think their presence is basically benign. When people have been injured, it's because they got too close to us, or we got too close to them, and something went awry. It's an accident took place. It's never. I don't think of there's anything where they've intentionally hurt somebody. Mm-hmm. So I'm just not frightened at all by the phenomenon. I'm very interested in it, and I am also thinking that if I could figure out how to contact them, then I maybe could travel interstellar distances, and that would be kind of cool,
Yeah, that would be pretty cool.
But to this point, they haven't contacted me. They haven't asked me to take a flight, and I don't really expect that to happen.
Absolutely. So, what is the most memorable UFO sighting that you've either been informed of, or you've come across in your research, or maybe even one that you experienced? What's one of the most memorable?
To me, the most documented, the best sighting is the UFO crash at Roswell, because we talked to so many witnesses, and I don't know how many times I've sit in living rooms with people listening to their tales, and then finding corroborative evidence. Somebody says, "Well, I was in Roswell in 1947," and we've got a yearbook that was produced for that year, and we can look it up and say, "Yes, this guy was actually there," and some stories corroborate and reinforce other stories. So that to me is the most important. But I just read a book about the Rendlesham Forest case. That was the guys in Great Britain in 1980. It was written by Nick Pope with John Burroughs and Jim Pedeston. And here is a very good case because it's heavily documented. There is, in fact, as Colonel Charles Halt was approaching the UFO or searching for it in the Rendlesham Forest area, he's got a handheld tape recorder, and so he's making live notes of what he's seeing and what he's perceiving at the time the event took place. So we have a record of it. There's very few sightings where we have the record of what was going on almost minute by minute, and then there's other documentation. So that's a very good case as well, and a very heavily documented case. Those are two cases where we're at Rendlesham, the craft landed. In Roswell, the craft crashed, so we were able to recover the debris. Rendlesham, there were landing traces and a spike in the radiation, the background radiation, and a lot of other ancillary evidence that went on there. So those are two very good cases.
So I kind of want to switch gears a little bit to your book, The Government UFO Files, and kind of get your opinion on what prompted you to want to write this book.
It's kind of the history aspect of it, and I think that when you look at the world of UFOs, everybody's got their own interest. I know there are some people who just, if you're not talking about an abduction, they're really not interested in what you have to say. Mm-hmm. There are others, if you're not talking about a crash or a crash retrieval, they're really not interested in what you have to say. Or the same with cattle mutilations and all these subsets of UFOs. But this book, you're looking at the history and the documentation and what the government what the government does in fact have in its files, and what you can learn from that. For example, there was in the 1980s we learned about something called Project Moondust, mm-hmm. and this was an attempt to retrieve returning space debris of foreign manufacture or unknown origin. Well, unknown origin clearly is UFO, mm-hmm. and we learned. And I think I pointed out in the book for the first time, we learned the date that this project began. Most people were speculating about it, but I found an actual letter in the Project Blue Book files that told us when it began. It was right after Sputnik, which makes sense. And this project continued on until 1985, when the State Department inadvertently compromised the code name, which is Project Moondust. Mm-hmm. And then they said, well, we've changed the code name. But when a United States Senator, Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico, queried the Air Force about Project Moondust, their answer to him was, there's never been such a project. And when the documentation was presented to them, the Air Force, they said, we'd like to amend our last statement. Yeah, the project existed, we never used it. We can prove it was actually deployed any number of times to retrieve material. And in a lot of cases, it turned out to be of terrestrial manufacture, but there's some very intriguing cases. And so, the reason for the book is to look at that sort of thing and say, here's what we've been told all these years, and here's what we can find by looking at the actual documentation that freedom of information and declassification has provided for us. And that's, how we get into the things like, well, there was a scientific study in the 1960s that proved there was nothing to UFOs. Well, that's really not what the study proved, and they were told what they were supposed to find. So how scientific is your study when you're told, fine, there's no threat to national security, there's nothing of scientific value to continue this investigation, and you may quit. So the book outlines all of these sorts of things and presents the documentation, including the cases that kind of drove some of these things, some of these investigations and the like, and delves into some of these things that haven't really been touched on before.
So you just mentioned it briefly, but I do want to delve in a little bit too. Can you take a moment to explain what Project Blue Book is?
Oh, I thought everybody knew that.
Not everybody.
Project Blue Book was the official Air Force investigation. The official investigation began in 1947 as Project Sign, and after 18 months or so, they said, well, we haven't found anything, we're stopping the investigation, it's all over, we're done. And here's our final report. And all they did was rename it Project Grudge and continue to march. They did the same thing in 1952. They said, well, we've investigated these things, we found nothing to it, we're ending our investigation, here's our final report. They changed the name to Project Blue Book. So Blue Book from about 1952 to 1969 was the official Air Force investigation into UFOs. At one time, it was manned by 2 officers and an NCO. They just really didn't do a whole lot to investigate stuff. The other thing that's important to remember here is General Bolander said in 1969 that UFO sightings that affected national security are not part of the Blue Book system. I mean, there was a separate reporting agency, a separate reporting channel for UFOs if it affected national security. And, you can point to any number of sightings. The best example is Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1968. There was a series of sightings there where the UFOs were actually able to shut down entire missile flights, rendered them inoperable. So if they needed to retaliate, they couldn't launch the missiles. An outside agency influenced the missiles in that way. That becomes a matter of national security. So a lot of the stuff that came out of Malmstrom in those series of sightings isn't in the Blue Book system. What we find is sightings from Belt, Montana, which is right outside of Malmstrom Air Force Base, where we have some sightings from there in the Project Blue Book files. So we look at that stuff, and we look at the UFO officer at Malmstrom talking to the guys from the University of Colorado study, and they're asking some questions. He says, I can't get into that. That's a matter of national security. So we can look at all of that and see how that transpired. And so that's kind of the thing I wanted to look at in the book, is present this information that I think hasn't been presented to this point in quite this of a condensed form.
Mm-hmm. Now, was it hard for you to find the documentation and information that you needed to write the book, the government UFO files, or was it easier than one might think?
If you tried to write something like this 30 years ago, you probably couldn't have done it, simply because FOIA didn't exist. And through FOIA, an awful lot of this information has come out, and a lot of people sort of contribute to that. And I could just give you a list of names from Michael Swords, for example, who was with the Center for UFO Studies and that sort of thing. Mark Rodiker, the guys for Cause Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, Larry Fawcett, Barry Greenwood. I mean, there's just tons of guys who've made FOIA requests, who've gathered the information, and so that when I had a question that I needed answered, there was some expert somewhere in that specific little tiny niche that I could go to, and they would either say, well, here's what you want to know, or this is where you should go to find the information that you need. So I think because of all that and the network through the internet, I could shoot off a query and in a matter of minutes have an answer, or use a cell phone so you don't run up phone bills that are horrendous like we used to.
Yeah.
I could get an answer very, very quickly, or I could go online and check records that I needed to check. The Project Blue Book files, for example, some of them are online, not all of them. I happen to have a complete microfilm set of the Project Blue Book files, so a lot of times I just go in and put it in the microfilm reader and look the stuff up myself. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the things I was doing, I was looking for a case in the 1960s, a specific case. I'm moving, scanning through the files, and it seemed to me that the term moondust went by, and I went back to that file and I found 4 cases in the Project Blue Book files labeled moondust. But they're really crappy cases. They're probably meteors or something like that. Mm-hmm. But for a very short period of time, some of the moondust stuff did make it in the Project Blue Book files. Nobody had ever found that before. Nobody had ever seen that before. So, but I was able to make that link. But the real point is, given today's environment, I could consolidate the information. I had access to an awful lot of people, and in my travels and investigations, I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of these people, so they know me. And so I knew how to get in touch with them to, and get the questions answered that I needed to get answered.
Now, I kind of want to switch gears and kind of broaden our horizons a little bit and talk about all your writings and kind of encompass them a little bit together. Do you, as you look back upon your works and the books that you've written, specifically those, relevant to UFOs, do you think that one book led to another? Could you identify the path that led you down or led your decisions to the certain books that you had?
Certainly. I'd done a lot of articles in UFO magazines prior to the first book as well, so I used some of that material. But if you take a look at when by we I mean Don Schmidt and I was doing the investigation of the Roswell case, we did the UFO crash at Roswell. And as we continued to work on that, we discovered a lot more information. And I thought, well, we can do an updated version of the book. And to convince the editor of that, I printed the new stuff on blue paper and the old stuff on white paper so he could just look at the manuscript at the edges of it and see all the blue in there to see what changes we'd made, what updates we'd made. But that also led me to another book called A History of UFO Crashes, which eventually led to another book which was Crash, When UFOs Fall from the Sky. So A History of UFO Crashes dealt with some specific cases, and at the very end there was a list of other possible crashes, including some moondust stuff. And Crash was a more comprehensive look. So you've got sort of an evolution of that sort of thing. And other aspects of the case came out. The Roswell book sort of introduced us into the idea of the government cover-up. So I did a book called Conspiracy of Silence, specifically about that sort of thing and how all of that came about. But it was the Roswell stuff that led into that book. And when we get to this latest book, even though Roswell isn't a part of this book, it was the research into Roswell that put me in contact with some of the people I needed to talk to, but B also provided some of the documentation. So I had that on hand because I've been filing the FOIA requests or getting copies of others, the FOIA requests from other people. So I had all of that stuff in hand. For example, I had a question about something that had to do with the FBI investigations, and I was able to email Bruce McAfee, for example, and Bruce, told me where to look for the specific things that I needed. So I mean, it's just that sort of thing. But it was just all of this came together, I guess, in this case, sort of serendipitously. But it all kind of built toward this book, providing this look at these specific things.
So, I know that when we first originally spoke, you briefly pointed me towards your ebooks. Can you kind of take a moment to talk about your ebooks and what?
Well, the reason I'd done that is I hadn't realized that the publisher had sent you a copy of the government files book, and so I get this note from you that you'd like to interview me and talk about the paranormal. Well, I don't think of UFOs as paranormal. I think of other things as paranormal, ESP, for example, or investigation goes, or past life regressions. And so when I get this thing and you're doing paranormal stuff, it just seemed to me that this ebook, which is only available at Amazon, by the way, but this ebook was a look at what began as an alien abduction investigation, and then it took this weird turn that neither I nor the guy I was working with expected, into past life regressions of this really nice, gentle woman who just had these horrific experiences in past lives as she related them to us. So it just took this bizarre turn there. So that was why I had mentioned that to you at the time, and I always thought it's kind of a fun little book. Well, actually, the topics she gets into aren't that much fun. It's an interesting book, and I think it's a quick read, and I think people will enjoy it. But but the other side of that coin, you've got this woman who is relating things to us under hypnotic regression, I should add, that she really shouldn't know, and we're being very careful not to feed her anything or give her any kind of reaction that she can feed upon. And she's just coming up with these really horrendous memories. So that was why I had mentioned that to you at that time, simply because I thought it fit more into a paranormal framework than that. And I'd done a book on near-death experiences in the mid-1990s. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of and you asked about things moving in those directions. That was sort of an outgrowth of that as well, because you're looking at past lives, and you're looking at the near-death experiences, and the alien abductions kind of led in that direction too, because even though it turns out there was no alien abduction involved in this case, we went into a different direction. We went a different direction. So I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to do, and an interesting way to go. And I kind of thought of it as sort of doing archaeology in a different way, because if the memories we're accessing are legitimate and real, then we're getting glimpses of the way the world was hundreds of years ago, and that sort of thing. So you gave us kind of an interesting perspective on things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know a lot of people that don't per se believe that, when you talk about things of the paranormal, you're not necessarily incorporating UFOlogy or cryptozoology. But I kind of have found, as time has progressed and more of these things have become a little bit more mainstream, as I would dare to hesitantly say, that the paranormal umbrella has kind of encompassed spirits, cryptozoology, and UFOlogy all underneath the paranormal umbrella, and each one, has various different branches that it branches off into. But it's just, from my personal experiences, that umbrella has become to encompass all those fields.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I think when you talk paranormal, you are talking about UFOs and cryptozoology and all these sorts of things. I'm just saying, in my personal reference, is when I got in your first email and thought of paranormal, paranormal UFOs didn't fit. To me, didn't fit under the umbrella of paranormal. I thought you were. I didn't realize that. Like I said, the publisher had sent you a copy of the book, so you were looking specifically at for the UFO stuff. So I was trying to think of something that that the work I'd done that I thought would fit more into what I think of as the paranormal realm. But you're absolutely right. UFOs fit into that. And if you look at UFOs, and you've got, under the UFO umbrella, you've got cattle mutilations, you have crop circles, you have crash retrievals, you have alien abduction. So you have all these subsets underneath the UFO umbrella. So the paranormal umbrella would spread much wider, and UFOs would fit under I wouldn't say a corner of that, but a portion of that.
Yeah, like a little branch of it. So,
yes.
Speaking of the UFO field just in general, I mean, I know that you know a lot of people and that you're pretty engulfed in it. A lot of people that I've talked to that are within the UFO field and kind of have, big something to say about something within the field seem to think that there's a lot of differences among UFOologists within the field, that, not everybody gets along, and that there's this kind of mainstream way of thinking within the UFO field that they want everybody to kind of follow. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but you're going to find that anywhere. If you look at academia, you've got the same thing. You've got people who follow the paradigm and go in that direction, and there's other people who get somewhat radical, and there's all kinds of those fights going on. If you look back at the beginning of paleontology, for crying out loud, the guys were blowing up each other's dinosaur beds so they wouldn't be able to make any great discoveries, and hiding materials and doing all kinds of nasty, deceitful things. And I've always wanted the field and to be a little bit to get along a little bit better, but they never have. And some people have the attitude, if you don't embrace their belief, whatever that belief might be, and you don't embrace it for whatever reason you have, then you're somehow an enemy, and you can't really sit down and discuss it and say, well, here's why I think you might be wrong on this particular point, and here's my evidence to support my position. What do you say? And look at it as a kind of a rational discussion. We too often get so hung up in our little niches that if somebody challenges it challenges a belief, we sometimes take it as an affront and an assault, when it just really is somebody trying to learn what was going on, or getting better information, or finding something that says, this thing you believe isn't quite right because of this, and here's why I say that. And instead of saying, well, that's very interesting, they say, well, you're a bad person. Or they say, the one I really cracks me up is they say, well, you can't trust what Kevin Randle says because he writes science fiction. But if that's true, then you begin to eliminate an awful lot of people in the UFO field, or the investigators who've written the books, because a lot of them have written science fiction as well. It's only that criticism's only directed at me for some bizarre reason, but you can look at an awful lot. Bruce Maccabee springs to mind again, because he's well entrenched in the UFO field, but he's written a book of science fiction. And you go down the list of the guys in the field who've written books on UFOs, but who've all written science fiction, and the list becomes very long.
Well, and I would agree with you, and I know that this is not just a problem within the UFO field, and I want to make that clear. I don't want you to think I'm just pointing out the UFO field. It's a problem within a lot of different sectors within the paranormal field altogether. And my viewpoint on this particularly, because I've talked to all kinds of different people and hear a lot of different viewpoints, is that if any one of us knew what the real truth was, and we knew exactly for 100%, with 100% certainty what was going on, nobody would be doing what we're doing anyways. We wouldn't be writing books speculating or hypothesizing or looking at different evidence and documentation. We don't know. And so, in my personal opinion, everyone's, professional opinions and hypothesis and the evidence that they collect have complete validity.
But there are points where you can look at something and you say, well, this is just flat wrong.
Yeah.
And it's wrong. But you're also right when you say that it's not just the UFO field; it's a lot of places. And if we did have the answers, we would be having a different tone of discussion. But we don't have all the answers. I know Chris O'Brien, who's done a lot of work on cattle mutilations, and somebody on the old UFO updates bulletin board, it asked one day what's some good books on cattle mutilations, and somebody put up a list of 3 or 4 books about cattle mutilation, and I just said that you also need to look at Mute Evidence, which is sort of the anti-mutilation book, to balance out what you're seeing there. And Chris O'Brien sent me a letter, and he said, well, if mutilations aren't taking place, or if it's not alien driven, how do you explain the lack of copper in the blood of the animals, some of the animals? And I thought, well, that's a damn good question. And what was really interesting is the internet was, I typed in copper deficiency in cattle, and now I know everything you could possibly want to know about copper deficiency in cattle, and how it comes about. So the fact that the blood of the animals was deficient in copper is not a direct result of alien intervention. There are terrestrial explanations. But he asked me a question, and I thought, well, that's a good question. Let's see see if there is an explanation for it. And and there's an awful lot of people that I've talked to, and we've disagreed about some things over the years, but we still maintain a cordial relationship because I think we respect each other's research. And then there are some people like Philip Glass who just enjoyed his role as a rat in the birthday cake. And he wasn't going to change his mind no matter what, because if he did that, then his role as a rat in the birthday cake went away. People wouldn't, he's compromised in that respect, as people would look at it and say, well, you said this one might be good, so you're not the great debunker you were.
Yeah.
And so, but by the same token, I maintained a cordial relationship with Philip Glass, too. So it's just sort of the way of the world, but we should be able to maintain cordial relationships and have a discussion. And if we could do that, we might get further down the road.
That's true. I agree with that 110%. So do you believe that we are coming to a point within the history of humanity in which we may start to become more aware of, UFOs, and that the general public is more accepting of it?
The public is pretty accepting of the idea now, I think, and a lot of it is evolved out of science fiction, because they look at Star Trek, they look at Star Wars, they look at all of this sort of thing, and the universe is filled with all sorts of populations, and I think they're more accepting of that possibility in today's world. But I think to get to the point where we have some definitive answers on UFOs, I think that is going to be precipitated by the aliens landing somewhere and saying, "Here we are. Take your pictures, and we'll chat with you later."
Yeah.
in an environment where you can't say no, it didn't happen. Although, on my blog, we were talking about this, and one of the guys said that even if you had alien bodies, I still wouldn't believe you. And I'm thinking, well, what an incredibly dumb thing to say.
Yeah.
If we had the alien bodies, we pretty well ended the discussion at this point.
Uh-huh.
But he wouldn't even believe it under those circumstances.
But you find that's in every aspect of life, that it doesn't matter.
Oh,
I mean, somebody could be diagnosed with cancer and they're going to say, I don't believe it. I mean, there's just that rarity that no matter at any point, they're just not going to believe it.
Well, yeah, you can look at the moon landings. There are people that are absolutely convinced we faked the whole thing. I don't know why, and it would seem that the evidence is pretty overwhelming that we did in fact land on the moon. But there are people who will just deny that and say, well, what about this? What about that? Well, it's explainable under the current science, for crying out loud.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a pretty big, elaborate thing to fake, and given the time period and I'm not seeing that. I mean, if it was like right now, I could see it, but not back then I just can't see that.
And well, that's the thing we have with UFO research today is all the kids, I really shouldn't say kids, with their knowledge of computers and the manipulation of the various programs can make an outstanding UFO film that looks real, and it's almost impossible to detect that it's fake. Mm-hmm. But if you look at some of the cases back from the 1950s where they were using 16-millimeter movie film, and the only way you could fake these sort of things was with a Hollywood studio, well, it was kind of easier to research those sorts of things in that time frame simply because the opportunities for fakery weren't so great.
Exactly. That's absolutely correct. So, in our last few minutes here, I just wanted to ask you, what kind of things do you got coming up, Mr. Randle? Anything exciting?
Well, I do very few lectures a year, but I'm doing one in Edinburgh, Texas, the Out of the World Festival down there in early June, I think the second weekend in June. And Catherine Martin will be there for those of you who are interested in abductions as well. So, I'm doing that. I've been working on other books and that sort of thing. But the one big lecture I have scheduled so far this year is the one down there in Edinburgh, Texas.
So, what kind of books do you have coming up that you're working on? Anything you can speak about, so to say?
Well, I'm talking to the publisher about sort of a book moving into the 21st century and looking at what we find from the government files as we move into the 21st century. And even though I say 21st century, one of the things I'd look at, and I've talked to the publisher about doing, is looking more at the Rendlesham Forest case, because there's some interesting documentation, and there's a British UFO study that came out that was sort of a result of that sort of thing. So it'd be interesting to look at that those sorts of cases. So, I'm doing that, and I put a lot of stuff up on my blog, little snippets of stuff that I find that is interesting that you can't flesh out into a magazine article or into a book, but little snippets of things that'll be interesting.
And I do want to go ahead, as we are fixing to conclude, and give Mr. Randle, I know he's mentioned his blog quite a few times, and it's actually been up on your screen throughout the night, and I forgot to plug it a couple of times, but I'm doing it now. It's been up on your screen throughout the evening. His address is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Please be sure to write that down and check it out. It is very interesting to see his blog and the various different posts that he puts up on his blog, as well as his newest book, which is The Government UFO Files, The Conspiracy of Cover-Up, and it is available on Amazon as well, and you can just go and buy it from there to make life easier.
And if they'd like to write a review, please do so.
Yes.
And even if it's a negative review, I don't care, because I sometimes find the negative reviews actually cause me to buy books. I've read negative reviews always seem to give you the information you need to whether you really want that book or not, even if somebody else hasn't liked it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I like the fact that there's two sides to every coin, and I like to see people's how their mentality works for different opinions and things of that nature. And I like to see negative and positive reviews too. You're not the only one.
the only time I've ever responded to a review on Amazon was somebody had written about one of the books. There's nothing new in this book. And I responded to him, look at the copyright date. It's 15 years old.
Yeah.
If you look at yes, there's nothing new because it's 15 years old. If I'd written it last week, then that would be a legitimate criticism.
Yeah, exactly. But it was 15 years ago, so that's not technically a legitimate criticism.
When the book came out, there was a lot of new stuff in it.
Yeah. So at least, okay, let me retract that previous statement. Be intelligent in your criticisms. Let's do that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Let's give good criticism and skepticism in an intelligent manner, which it makes sense and is legitimate. So that I do appreciate. Well, I want to thank you so much, Mr. Randle, for being on, and it was a great pleasure. And your next book, if you want to come on, just give me a holler, and we can promo that book and talk all about it.
Or I could say if you've got a hole in your programming and you need a guest, give me a shout.
Absolutely, I will definitely do that. And I want to let all the viewers know that next week I will be talking with Richard Dolan. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Randle, for being on. And his website is up on your screen currently. Once again, it's www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Please be sure to check him out and check out his blog, which he is very interactive with and posts many, many things currently. And check out all of his books, too, because they're really awesome. So, see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in, and we definitely do appreciate it. And I'll see you right back here next week. Same time, same place. You guys have a great week.